Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on a really crucial structural question that comes out of the pastoral epistles. We're looking at the specific roles of Timothy and Titus and what their unique biblical designation implies, or maybe even demands, for our church leadership models today.
And this is such a vital topic because, really, the identities of these two key figures, Paul's immediate helpers, they're just foundational to how we understand the early church's organizational chart. The core issue is whether our modern structures have, well, mistakenly lumped them in with settled local leaders, and in doing so, introduce some pretty significant functional errors.
Exactly. So the central question we're facing is this. Does the recognized unique function of Timothy and Titus, which was, essentially to be itinerant helpers, tasked with appointing and keeping senior local leaders in line, does that mandate establishing a permanent, separate, modern track for young men that's analogous to their title, True Son in the Faith, as a necessary remedy for all the harm caused by this conflation?
So it's a debate over whether a specific historical assignment requires a lasting institutional framework today, or if we just need to, double down and reinforce the leadership standards we already have in the Bible.
My position, and this is drawing from the source material we're looking at, is that the distinction is absolutely crucial. The true son in the faith, well, it describes a distinct office that has been structurally lost, and this loss has caused severe harm, what the source calls tragic damage, by prematurely placing young, gifted, but frankly unqualified men into the senior settled roles of pastor or elder. So a separate track designed to capture the nature of their original assignment is essential. I'm advocating for that structural fix.
And I come at it from a bit of a different way. I readily acknowledge that Timothy and Titus held a unique, sort of non-pastoral function. I see that. However, I'd argue the problem lies not in the absence of a distinct office, but primarily in the failure to adhere rigorously to the existing, very explicit biblical criteria for the established roles of pastors and elders, the ones in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. The solution for me is strict adherence to those qualifications about maturity and stability, not necessarily inventing a new permanent office that's analogous to what was at its heart an apostolic assignment.
Well, let's start with precision because the source material really demands it. We have to define Timothy and Titus based on their proper title, Dilecto Filio in Fide. That translates as true son, or maybe more literally, authentic child in the faith. Now, this isn't a minor distinction. The text we're looking at specifically rejects other titles we tend to use, like lieutenant, or understudy, or assistant, and crucially, they were never called pastor, elder, or overseer, even though they had authority over those very roles. They were, in effect, an apostolic proxy.
And that conceptual clarity it's invaluable. I agree. Acknowledging that Timothy and Titus weren't themselves functioning as settled local pastors or elders, that helps us accurately chart the structure of authority in the early church. Their function was clearly supervisory and itinerant.
And this distinction defines their big task. They were fundamentally itinerant. They were always moving, not permanently located in one place. And their unique responsibility was, and I'm quoting here, going places, appointing and keeping senior pastors, elders, overseers in line. They had this immense functional authority that came from their connection to Paul, but they weren't technically one of the settled local leaders they were organizing. And this is exactly why the source material insists this highlights an important office in the church that has long been lost, which leads directly to this destructive, inconsiderate conflation with the permanent pastor-elder role.
The function was specialized. It was authoritative, certainly. But let's turn to the consequence you mentioned, this tragic damage. We really need to clarify what this structural loss actually looks like on the ground.
Oh, the damage is profound. It's tangible. Because this true son track is lost, the church really only has one senior path, the pastorate or the eldership. So what happens is you get these talented, theologically sharp, zealous young men, and they're funneled into these settled, permanent positions long before they have the necessary life qualifications. And this results in that tragic damage of sending young people Without the proper biblical pre-qualifications, I'm talking about maturity, tested character, and proven family stability into roles that absolutely require them. The consequences are, well, their widespread failure. It damages their congregations, it destabilizes their own families, and it harms the community testimony. The source is very clear on that.
I acknowledge that this damage happens, of course. But I guess I question whether the lost title or office is the true root cause. We agree that the true son was distinct, but the specific reason that young men are deemed unsuitable for the pastorate, according to the criteria in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, is that they are, quote, too young and inexperienced.
Precisely.
They are too young for the settled, permanent pastorate.
But doesn't that suggest the issue isn't really the absence of a true son office, but a simple failure to follow the explicit, existing qualifications for the pastorate? I mean, let's look at the source's interpretation of 1 Timothy 3:5, the need for a man to manage his own household well. The source draws a really strong conclusion there, suggesting candidates should wait until their kids have flown the coop, so to speak, and they can model the pastorate on their own mature homes. Now, if local churches just ignore that high standard, they're going to see this tragic damage, whether or not they have some true son track running in parallel. The problem seems to be accountability.
But see, that is the definition of the conflation. You're forcing this young, gifted man to wait 30 years before he can use his gifts for the church's highest theological work, just because he doesn't meet the family stability requirement of the located elder. We lose decades of valuable contribution.
Well, that brings us to the core of it, the locus of the problem. You argue the damage comes from the structural office conflation. I'm maintaining that the damage stems directly from ignoring the criteria for maturity and family stability right there in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. So is the problem truly the loss of the true son title, or is it the oversimplification and subsequent neglect of the rigorous pastoral qualifications we already have?
That's an interesting way to put it, though I would frame it differently. The source material emphasizes that while we try to separate these roles conceptually, oversimplification is such a complicated word. The conflation is the problem, because it ignores that Timothy and Titus fulfilled a function that did not require the stringent life stage qualifications of the permanently located elder. By failing to offer a separate, recognized track for these true sons, the institutional church leaves no biblically analogous option for those who might be too young and inexperienced for that settled life, but who still possess these advanced theological gifts.
But why does a structural vacuum force a local congregation to hire these young men into senior roles prematurely? I mean, why not just mentor them, use them as teachers, and simply wait until they meet the maturity criteria?
Because if we only have the settled pastorate as the ultimate goal, these highly capable, zealous, articulate young men, they feel pressured to attain it. And local churches, they're often desperate for gifted leadership, and they're willing to lower the bar to get them. Without a separate, sanctioned avenue for advanced, itinerant theological work, these gifts are either misapplied in that senior role, causing the harm we talked about, or they're sidelined entirely. And sidelining them causes the church to lose what the source calls the wisdom of God and the theological depth they are ready to offer in a supportive capacity. The separate track provides a proper, productive, biblical outlet for their gifts without putting them in roles that require a tested family stability they just can't possess yet.
Right, I see the dilemma. Utilization versus qualification. But I'm still skeptical that the solution is to create a whole new and potentially confusing institutional role.
And that leads directly to the necessity and scope of this modern true son track. I see why you think we should just enforce the old rules, but let me give you a different perspective on the proposed solution. The source explicitly mandates that the remedy is a separate track, one that involves advanced missionary or theological doctoral studies, where these young men go on deputation permanently.
Go on deputation? That just sounds like classic mission work.
It is mission work, but it's structurally defined by its relationship to local church governance. This new track is analogous to the trusted association with the apostle, and it functions to offer genuine care and theological refreshment and refinement to settled pastors and elders. It institutionalizes that specialized mobile function,
It's a structural fix for what is a structural vacuum.
I come at it from a different way regarding the analogy, though. While creating a pathway for advanced theological studies and itinerant ministry is, well, it's admirable, every church needs theological refreshment, we have to evaluate whether this proposal truly addresses the functional authority of the original true sons. The historical Timothy and Titus held immense transformative authority. They were appointing and keeping senior pastors, elders, overseers in line. I mean, that was direct structural power.
And their authority was derived from the apostolic relationship, which was foundational.
Exactly. So does a modern track focused on theological doctoral studies and offering refreshment, does that truly carry this specific functional authority? The right to organize and sometimes discipline senior local leadership? If the new track is primarily about theological care and church planting support, it starts to sound more like a specialized academic role, or even an elevated assistant or apprentice, which, as you said, the source material explicitly ruled out as an accurate title for them. If the proposed role lacks that specific authoritative task, is it truly an analogous office? Or is it just a new form of highly educated ministry that's going to cause a lot of institutional confusion over who reports to whom?
Well, we have to find the modern structural equivalent of an authority. While we lack Paul, of course, the authority is transferred through the institutional structure. It's analogous to the apostles' mandate, but focused on organizational stability and theological alignment across a network of churches. The core function is still refinement and organization. The historical context demands a modern structural equivalent to fill that gap and to prevent the talent leakage we discussed.
I just find the comparison a little stretched, because the primary distinction of the true sons was their direct tie to the apostles' unique authority, and that's something that just cannot be institutionalized today.
We should circle back to defining maturity for pastoral leadership, because this really is the linchpin that justifies separating the roles. The source material defines the readiness criteria for the traditional pastorate with a great specificity. Building a well-bred family, demonstrating a solid work resume outside of ministry, and waiting until their kids have flown the coop so they can model the pastorate after their own homes, which is from 1 Timothy 3.5. This highlights that permanent located leadership requires a specific long-term life stage and a tested stability that frankly takes decades to achieve.
That standard of kids flown the coop that is a rigorous and a very specific interpretation of 1 Timothy 3.5.
It is rigorous, yes, and it is the necessary bar to prevent the collapse of permanent leadership. The True Son track exists precisely for those who do not yet meet these stringent life qualifications, who are still starting their families or their careers, but who are still needed for immediate itinerant ministry and deep theological work. It respects both their youth and their gifts by giving them a different structural function.
That's a compelling argument for respecting the limitations of youth, but have you considered that if the primary failure is just ignoring the clear criteria regarding family life and proven maturity, the very criteria you just laid out so well, then shouldn't all the organizational energy be spent reinforcing those standards instead of diverting talented young men into an analogous track? I mean, the cost of establishing and promoting an entirely new structure, a new deputation office, it's enormous.
But diverting them prevents them from causing harm in a position they are not qualified for. It gives them a productive biblical role that maximizes their current intellectual gifts. If we just tell them to wait, we risk losing them, or worse, seeing them fail in the settled pastorate.
But if we agree that the catastrophic damage is caused by the oversimplification and the reduction of that high bar in 1 Timothy 3, then creating a new separate role might just add complexity without solving the fundamental lack of rigorous application of qualifications for pastors and elders. We would be trying to institutionalize a new position when we haven't yet mastered the discipline required to maintain the integrity of the existing ones. The problem structurally seems to be discipline, not definition.
We have certainly covered substantial ground here, exploring this need for a structural remedy. My argument, at the end of the day, remains rooted in the recognition of Timothy and Titus as dilecto filio in fe, distinct from permanent located pastors, elders, or overseers.
A distinction based on function and context that, yes, I readily grant.
And this distinction points to a necessary, if lost, office for itinerant young men performing very sophisticated work focused on organizational strength,
theological refreshment and refinement, and church planting support. The creation of a separate track, one focused on advanced study and deputation, is the clear structural remedy proposed in the source to prevent the tragic damage that happens when young men are incorrectly placed into roles requiring a specific life maturity and a tested stability they just can't possess yet.
In my position, to sum up, acknowledges the accurate identification of that unique, specialized function of Timothy and Titus, but it cautions against institutionalizing a permanent analogous office. The focus should remain on the rigorous pre-qualifications for permanent church leadership that are already outlined in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, particularly concerning age, experience, and home modeling. If we just maintain the integrity of the pastoral standard, these talented young men will naturally find necessary, valuable roles without us needing to create a specific and potentially confusing, authoritative office analogous to a unique historical apostolic assignment.
So it's ultimately a question of whether the failure lies in the existing institutional structure or in the discipline of the individuals within it.
Precisely. And the material requires us to deeply consider the biblical standards for church leadership and whether the historical function of these key Pauline helpers really mandates a structural change in how modern churches select and deploy their younger, theologically gifted leaders, or whether we simply need a renewed commitment to the high standards we already possess.